All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a pretty provocative idea, one that takes a power dynamic that's been around for centuries and flips it completely on its head. We're talking about Occidentalism.
Think about it. For ages, the academic and cultural gaze has pretty much flowed in one direction, from the West, looking out at the rest of the world. So what happens when that gaze gets returned? What happens when the thing being studied decides to start studying back?
Now, to really get a handle on Occidentalism, we first have to understand the dynamic it's trying to reverse. And that story starts with the long-established field of Orientalism.
So this chart lays out the basic power structure. In Orientalism, the West is the subject, the one doing the knowing, the defining, the studying. The East is the object, the thing that is passively studied and analyzed. Well, Occidentalism comes along and proposes a radical flip of that script. The East becomes the subject, turning a critical eye back onto the West, which now becomes the object of study. It's a total reversal of those intellectual roles. But you might be wondering, why is this reversal so important? According to the source material we're looking at, this isn't just some academic game. It's a direct response to a really deep cultural crisis. At the very heart of this crisis is something the author calls teshrib, or westernization. And we're not just talking about enjoying Western movies or fashion here. No, it's described as a much deeper kind of dependency, where Western culture starts to overwhelm everything, from intellectual life to your daily routine, and that threatens a society's own sense of self, its own independence.
And to help us really picture this problem, the author uses this fantastic metaphor. Imagine a culture that's trying to walk on two legs that are dangerously, critically out of balance. So let's break that down. One leg is the culture's own ancient heritage. It's described as long and strong, but it's been neglected, so it's weak. The other leg is the imported Western heritage. It's described as short and swollen, basically from overuse. I mean, you can just picture it, right? Trying to walk like that doesn't get you anywhere. It just leads to stumbling, instability, and ultimately dependency. And the crisis that results from this is captured so powerfully in this quote from the source. This imitation starts to feel like real life, but it's actually a delusion that kills the soul. It's this idea of a culture trapped between two worlds, mistaking the copy for the genuine article, and that, the author argues, is a path to cultural death. Okay, so if that's the problem, this deep cultural imbalance, what's the fix? Well, this is where the author introduces a brand new discipline, the science of Occidentalism. So Occidentalism is set up as this new critical field of study. And what's the goal? To break the cycle of either blindly copying the West or just emotionally rejecting it. It's about finding a third way, a systematic, objective study of the West itself. It's really about taking back control of the story, turning the microscope back on the civilization that for so long has been the only one holding it. And the psychological goal here is huge. The idea is that by flipping these roles, both cultures can actually be freed from these complexes that history has sort of assigned them. The East can shake off a perceived inferiority complex by becoming the one who studies. And the West has to confront its superiority complex by being seen not as some universal standard, but as one specific civilization among many. This all builds into a pretty clear four-step project, almost like a roadmap to cultural freedom. First, you move from just imitating to actually creating. Second, you build a critical, objective viewpoint, not just a reactive one. A huge piece of this is dismantling that old map of center versus periphery. And the final goal? Real, honest-to-goodness cultural and intellectual independence. But how exactly do you study the West in this way? I mean, how do you do it without just falling back into old habits? The key insight from the source is that this isn't about borrowing. It's about deconstruction. Yeah, this is not a shopping trip for ideas. The point isn't to pick and choose what to borrow. It's to analyze the very DNA of European consciousness, to understand its foundational building blocks, and figure out how it came to see itself as universal in the first place. It's kind of like an intellectual excavation. So the project lays out what it calls the declared sources of this consciousness. It's basically mapping the intellectual journey that Occidentalism wants to unpack.
It's a path that goes all the way from Greco-Roman thought and Judeo-Christian foundations through the Enlightenment and the Age of Science, and all the way up to modern ideas like existentialism and analysis.
And the whole point of this deconstruction is captured perfectly in this quote: to return the culture of the West to its natural historical boundaries. The argument here is that Western culture expanded way beyond its own borders during the colonial era and started presenting itself as universal. So Occidentalism is the project of putting it back in context, seeing it as one important but ultimately local piece of the human story.
So what's the endgame here? After all this analysis, what's the point? Well, this isn't about building walls or isolation. According to the source, it's about creating the right conditions for a totally new kind of global conversation.
So the author points out two paths that are basically dead ends. You've got blind imitation on one side and absolute rejection on the other. Both are just reactions, right? Occidentalism tries to forge a third path, a path of critical understanding. And this, supposedly, is what paves the way for a real dialogue between equals, where different cultures can finally talk to each other on their own terms.
So the intended outcome here is, well, it's transformative. It's about ending the myth that there's one single universal culture. It's about healing that internal cultural split so a society can finally create something new, something authentic. And from that place of strength, it can engage with the rest of the world not as a follower, but as an equal.
And that really is the core ambition, isn't it? It's a declaration of intellectual independence. The goal is to finally graduate from being the perpetual student who only learns from one teacher, and instead to take a seat at the table as an equal partner, co-authoring the ongoing story of human thought. Which kind of leaves us with this final big question for our super interconnected world. Who really gets to hold the pen? Who gets to decide what's central and what's on the fringe? Who gets to write the story of us all? Thanks for joining us on The Explainer.